Good evening. My name is Tim Chapin. I have the great pleasure to be the Dean of the College of Social Sciences and Public Policy, which is home to the Institute of Politics at Florida State University. I want to welcome you to our legislative preview panel this evening. Before we begin, let me say a few words about the IOP at FSU. It's a world-class, nonpartisan, nationally renowned institute aimed at promoting civil discourse and civic engagement in politics and public service. We're grateful for the support of the state legislature, Governor DeSantis, a dear friend of FSU and my boss, President John Thrasher, and IOP visionary Al Cardenas for recognizing the importance of citizen involvement, public service, and political discourse. One of the primary goals of the IOP at FSU is to provide students, faculty, and community members with opportunities for civic engagement that is also civil engagement. Through our academic fellowships, scholarly research, and public programming, we hope to raise the level of political discourse in American society. Tonight, we're going to have a wonderful session with two esteemed speakers that I'll introduce in a minute. After we do that for about half an hour, 40 minutes, there'll be time for Q&A from attendees at that time. You can post your questions using the moderated Q&A box on the screen, and we're going to attempt to get to as many questions as we can when we get to that point. I now want to introduce our two panelists. Gary Fineout is author of Florida Playbook and joined Politico in February 2019. He has covered state government, politics, and education in Florida for more than 25 years, including for the last 5 governors. Fineout has worked for the Associated Press, the Miami Herald, the Tallahassee Democrat, and has done articles for numerous publications, including the New York Times. He is a graduate of Florida State University with a degree in American and Florida Studies. Jennifer Greene is president and owner of Liberty Partners of Tallahassee, which was founded in 2007. With nearly 25 years of experience in political, lobbying, and grassroots activities in the state of Florida, she consults primarily on state legislative and executive branch issues affecting corporations, trade associations, local governments, and not-for-profits. She too is a graduate of Florida State University with a degree in political science. Gary and Jennifer, thank you for joining us tonight. And you can go ahead and turn on your screens and mics, and I'm going to go ahead and get us started with the moderated portion of the session. What I'd like to do is start with sort of a legislative session 101, if you don't mind. Gary, I'm going to tap you first. Can you talk to us about sort of the basics of the Florida Legislature, how it works, the timing of the session, and sort of the mandatory outcomes of the legislative session, please?
Yeah, sure. I'll give it a shot here. So the Florida Legislature meets every year. Sometimes it's in January, sometimes it's in March. They do it every other year. They switch off, and it's a 60-day session, and basically what that means is that Florida, unlike a lot of other states, does not have a full-time year-round legislature, or even one that meets for 6 months or what have you, and it makes it quite interesting because that means they have to get a lot done in a very condensed period of time. And technically, the only bill that they really need to pass is the Annual Appropriations Act, the state budget. Although sometimes, a lot of times of late, they don't get it done during the 60 days, and sometimes they go into overtime. But I mean, the thing about it is that they take up lots of bills. I mean, normally anywhere from 2,000 to 3,000 bills each year are filed. But what's important to note is most of them don't pass. And one of the operating principles of the legislature is that it's easier to kill a bill than it is to pass a bill, and that's something to always kind of keep in mind.
Very good.
And then the last thing is, the Republicans have controlled state government for more than 2 decades, and obviously the last several governors have been Republican, although one switched parties after he left the governorship. And the legislature has been Republican. Now it's kind of ebbed and flowed. There was a time in the after the 2010 elections that they actually had super majorities. That's kind of that the Democrats made some inroads the last couple of cycles, although the Republicans made gains this past go round. So
very good. That's wonderful. Great primer, Gary. Jennifer, you work up there on the Hill regularly, and yet you are actively involved with a number of your clients. Talk to us about how the legislature actually gets work done. What's the sort of the typical day like, and how does the work of making law and shaping the budget actually happen?
That's a really funny question. It happens in a lot of different manners. I think this year it's going to be in a manner that we haven't seen before. And part of that is, physically, my office is a block from the Capitol, and I truly have not set foot in the Capitol since last March. Haven't had a reason to be in the Capitol or a meeting in the Capitol. I know Gary has probably been in and has been through his COVID testing as a reporter to be able to go in the Capitol. In terms of how the legislature functions, it's very cyclical in Florida. As Gary mentioned, we have every other year, our legislative session on even number year starts in January. It means they go home early in an election year, hopefully after 60 days. So this year we're in a late year, if you will, the normal time. It's the first Tuesday after the first Monday in March. And we start session on March 2nd. We're supposed to end on April 30th. A whole host of things can happen. The budget is the only thing that has to pass. But as Gary mentioned, there's thousands of bills that are filed. And I think the last couple of years, looking at some statistics, there's somewhere between 15 and 2,000 bills that are filed, general bills, and about 11% of them end up passing. And that means they pass both the House and the Senate. So it's a process of a really big funnel, I think is the best way to describe. A lot of analysis. You have legislation that has to go through 2, 3, 4 different committees in the House, and the same thing over in the Senate. So a lot of people looking at bills, and sometimes, we talk about it being like making sausage. You don't want to watch it. But for the most part, it's a pretty open process. We're very fortunate in Florida to have public records laws that are much more open in terms of government and access of being able to see what's happening in the process than other states, candidly.
Very nice, very nice. So the Sunshine State is known for its sunshine laws, that we do government in the sunshine. Very nice. Jennifer, can I also ask you to talk about what's the role of the governor in the legislative session? That's something that a lot of people maybe don't quite understand is what's the role of the governor versus the elected state legislators?
Sure. Great division of power in Florida in terms of our branches. We have a cabinet of 4 members. The governor is a member of the cabinet, and the governor's role, particularly right now, is to actually propose a budget. The governor has put out his budget recommendations, and I'm going to give one little plug for 3 websites for everybody here. If you don't have them, write it down. Go to myflorida.com. That's basically the main website. You can go to the governor's office from there. flsenate.gov and myfloridahouse.gov. You got all 3 main websites you need to get to. So the governor's office, the House and Senate. But the governor's role is really to set some general policies from the executive branch. And that's really it. He can talk about, he'd like to see a piece of legislation passed. He provides his budget recommendations with the governor's budget recommendations. He calls it, this year, it's the Florida Leads budget. So you can actually, from myflorida.com, get to the governor's website and click through his budget initiatives. But it really is just a framework. It's a recommendation based on agencies and agency suggestions. And then it's the legislature that actually has to pass a budget. And they pass it, send it to the governor. And if we're in the session, the governor has 7 days to act on a bill, which the budget is. Outside of session, it's 15 days. And the governor can, on the budget, has line item veto. And that's kind of interesting. Some other states don't have that. But he can go in and an entire line, and there actually is a line number in the budget that the governor could veto that entire line item versus picking through certain things. But that's really his role, is to be the final arbiter, either approve a bill, sign it, let it become law without his signature, or veto it. That is the role on all general bills and on the budget.
Outstanding, outstanding, wonderful. So this is Civics 101 for our attendees. Thank you for that. Let's now talk a little bit, Gary. I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about sort of the state and its fiscal status. I know that we're very worried. The budget is always a challenge for the legislature. There's a lot more needs than there are resources, typically, or at least that's the discussion. This year, we're in a particularly challenged time around COVID, and we're going to get to the COVID problems and responses later. But let's talk about the fiscal status. Where is the state in terms of its financial setting right now?
It's quite challenging for the state. So the situation is basically that the series of things that happened associated with the pandemic and COVID and the ensuing, even though Florida did not have as lengthy a lockdown as some other states, it still had a lockdown. Obviously, tourism is a very big part of Florida's economy, and the tourism industry has been hard hit by the pandemic. And the long and short of it is that basically um, the bottom kind of dropped out of the tax collections. What's important to note is that while there are a multitude of sources used for the state budget, one of the primary sources is sales tax. So that's consumption. And so when you don't have goods consumed, it causes an impact to the budget. So after everything was said and done, basically, well, and I want to stop back and say, and Congress played a key pivotal role in helping things kind of stay together, because essentially the CARES Act was a substantial amount of money that was sent down to the state of Florida. And basically, if you look at all the numbers, if that money had not come in from Congress, they probably would have had to have gone into special session, and they would have had to order mid-year budget cuts due to a deficit. Now, it's important to note, words get thrown around. Right now, they're not in a deficit. What they are is in a perceived shortfall. And essentially, they do a projection once a year. There was one that came out in September that put it at about 2.7 billion shortfall. And then they've kind of recalibrated it a little bit. They now suggest it's a little over 2 billion. But the long and short of it is that you can't, you're going to have to figure out how to close that gap. And when we say shortfall, I want to make sure it's important to note that what we're talking about is that when you've looked at the amount of money you think the state is going to take in versus the expenditures that are considered to be somewhat mandatory. And that's part of the give and take that will happen this session is how much needs to be spent on schools. There's a big debate going back and forth about missing students and things of that nature. How much is going to be spent in Medicaid, which is the state federal program, healthcare program that's primarily for the poor and also used for nursing home costs for the elderly. That has seen a great uptick during COVID-19, the costs associated with that program. So basically, the balancing act for the legislature is where are they going to cut, and are they going to find any revenue enhancements, for lack of a better word? Now, I think we've seen in the Senate, a motion has already moved on a bill that would try to capture online taxes in terms of the collection of online taxes. There's some talk about making it revenue neutral now. That language hasn't actually been, actually sort of passed out. They just kind of discussed in the last committee stop that was a goal, so that it's not viewed as a tax increase. A couple of years ago, under then Governor Scott, constitutional amendment was passed by the voters that requires any tax or fee increase to be passed by 2/3 vote of the legislature. So that's sort of the big picture. But the thing to remember is that there's probably going to be cuts somewhere, and it's a question of how do they approach that and where do they do that. And without getting too far into the weeds, the budget affects almost everything else. For the people who are insiders, they know that the Appropriations Act has a dramatic effect on the give and take of session. If you can't reach a deal on the budget, it's unlikely you're going to reach deals on other parts of legislation, and that's because there's bargaining, there's trading that's going on, and as one lawmaker once said, and it's been repeated many times, everything is connected to everything. It's really hard to grasp for people who are outside of the process, but it's just, this is when Jennifer was talking about how the sausage gets made and you don't want to watch it, that this is part of it, where there's all sorts of connections and things that are all linked together. But the point is that the budget is sort of, I like to refer to it as, it's the grease that keeps the engine turning.
Very good. Thank you, Gary. Jennifer, let me ask you, what about, there's a budget stabilization fund and reserves. How does that play in? How has the federal stimulus money supported the state? Can you speak a bit more about that? And then we're going to turn our attention to sort of the COVID response from the state.
Sure. So I think the number is about 6.6 billion is what we have in reserves. And just to give you some context of what Florida's budget looks like, right now the governor's recommended budget is about 96.6 billion. That's a big number, grown every year. The final budget for fiscal year 2020-2021, we're on a July 1 to June 30 fiscal year, The final budget after the governor vetoed $1 billion out of it was $92.2 billion. So think about this. We have a budget we're in right now that is $92.2 billion, and starting July 1, the governor's proposed budget is up to a $96.6 billion. Some of that certainly is reliant upon federal dollars or stimulus dollars, but not largely. He does not touch much or any, candidly, in the budget stabilization fund, the 6.6 billion or so in reserves. And the one thing that I think is probably important to look at is, and to drill down into, is what Gary talked about in terms of the budget itself. It's not a shortfall like you have a budget at your house and not enough money has come in and you're not really sure what to do. There's a projected amount of revenue coming into the state. That projected revenue is not being met. That doesn't mean that we don't have a balanced budget. So the one thing Florida has to have is a balanced budget. We don't do what the federal government does and we borrow against, or we print new money, or we do. Florida has to walk away with a balanced budget. And should the budget start to not be balanced like we had with the pandemic, as Gary mentioned, the legislature could have had to come back and actually address the issue. And I think hindsight being 2020, it was very smart that the governor and the legislature really did not have the budget addressed until the end of June. So we finished session that third week in March, a week late. The budget had been passed, but the legislature actually didn't transmit it and send it to the governor until the end of June. So just a couple of days before the fiscal year is supposed to start over, the governor is making those final decisions. So we actually had a couple months of cushion to be able to do some holdbacks within agencies. And there's been several budget cutting exercises that I know the governor has directed his agencies to go through as well. I would also agree, again, in everything being connected, if you can look at it in terms of like a sweater. And if you start to pull at a couple of things, a lot of things might unravel. You just sort of have to figure out where they are. And again, it's typically every year those same issues come up. We talk about funding for education. We talk about funding for different programs. And COVID has just simply really sort of thrown a wrench into all of it in terms of sucking away a lot of the funds that are needed both at the state level, but also at the local level, which you saw that the CARES Act dollars coming through came down to Florida. It was, I think, 1.57 or so billion, but you had 12 counties that got money directly from the Treasury. 55 other counties had their money flowing through the governor's office policy and budget in terms of how they were, they were allocated based on population, but all of that was a brand new issue to deal with. So you have your state government in this, oh my gosh, we're taxing our budget as it is. And then you've got local government, like 67 counties and then 400 and so cities that are also seeing those same struggles as they've had to reallocate funds to address issues related to COVID.
So the budget trickles down to every local community, either directly or indirectly. Thank you. Thank you. Let's talk about the cause of some of these budget challenges, COVID and the pandemic more generally. Jennifer, as you look ahead to the coming session, what issues related to the pandemic do you anticipate the legislature will be talking about and maybe acting upon? And again, I would remind all of our attendees, we're projecting ahead. We offer no guarantees, but we're trying to understand and project. So Jennifer, what do you see ahead?
So I think probably the things we see ahead are those they've already filed or already talked about. If you want to follow what's going on, again, WFSU and the Florida Channel has a great resource. So you can be anywhere in the state and watch committee meetings or watch press conferences. But right now, the legislature, both the House and the Senate, have talked, and including the governor, have talked about this COVID liability reform. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about what that means. But in particular, there's a very big concern for businesses around the state, whether it's restaurants, hotels, theme parks, any type of business. What is going to happen down the road after we get through at least the emergency orders and kind of where we are this first year? What happens when people get sued? So many businesses are struggling financially. The threat of being sued because someone believes that they got COVID or they were exposed to COVID on that property. I mean, many of you that have gone back to, we'll say, your barbershop or your hair salon, you might be signing forms that say, I'm waiving all my responsibility here. Now, don't know how well that'll hold up in court, but the point being is there's a sensitivity to what will happen when the lawsuits start. And so the House and the Senate are working on legislation that actually have bifurcated the issue into one bill that deals for COVID liability for general businesses, And then there's one that deals with COVID liability for healthcare. So providers, hospitals, long-term care facilities. Those are a little more complicated of issues because, again, they've been on the front lines. The bills are moving a little bit differently. I think you'll see based on what the House Speaker has said. He hopes that the House Bill 7 passes very early. We start session on Tuesday, so a week from today. I think you'll see that bill move very quickly. And then, of course, the discussion will happen on the healthcare side. But the concern is, again, from an economic standpoint, you have so many businesses that have been shuttered because of not being able to be open. And that is with Florida being open. We're not a lockdown state. So we are very, very fortunate that it could have been much worse in terms of our economic environment.
Very good, very good. Thank you, Jennifer. Gary, on the COVID front, what else do you see possibly being discussed or maybe not being discussed?
Well, and that's the important thing. I think there's an element of this of what is not being discussed. There are two panels in the House and Senate that have been assigned to look at issues involving the pandemic. I think one big topic that has not been talked about so far, I mean, there's promises to talk about it, but it has not emerged yet, is what happened with the unemployment system. There was basically a meltdown of the electronic portal that people needed to access in order to be able to claim unemployment benefits. There has been a tremendous amount of money that's been paid out by the state, but majority of it is in federal money. Basically, if you want to do the math, the current minimum unemployment payment, weekly payment, I should say the maximum unemployment payment that is available to any employee is $275 a week, which, if you do the math, comes down to about $6.87 per hour. It's less than the current minimum wage. There appears to be very little appetite inside the legislature to deal with that, and that part of it is because of the connection that it has to the Unemployment Compensation Trust Fund. Basically, businesses pay taxes into that trust fund, and then that money is then used to pay out benefits to unemployed workers. Now, during the Great Recession, that trust fund went dry, and it required the Florida to borrow money from the federal government. And what's interesting is what has not been discussed a lot is that there was actually a small tax hike that went into effect at the beginning of the year because the trust fund amount had gotten down to a certain amount. But so far, the Democrats have filed a bunch of bills dealing with the amount of the benefits, the duration of benefits, and things of that nature. So far, there's no sign that those bills will be heard or even agended. There has been discussion about at least having a conversation about what went wrong with what's known as the Connect system. There's an Inspector General report that's due. There's the Department of Economic Opportunity has enacted its own. They hired a firm to look at what's going on. Suffice to say, I would imagine it would probably be a substantial amount of money to do some sort of major rebuild. I just don't know where that's going to wind up. I would say the other thing that is kind of out there on the radar a little bit is a conversation about executive authority and executive power, and it kind of cuts both ways. There are some bills moving through that would basically codify some decisions that the governor made. He allowed certain things to happen by the use of his emergency power, that he can, he has the authority to say, okay, it's an emergency, I'm going to waive certain laws and do certain things. And for the most part, by the way, he spent $5.8 billion that way. We were talking earlier about the legislature not being here. One of the more remarkable things that I had never seen happen is the legislature basically allowed the governor to spend billions of dollars with barely any oversight and without any control over the purse strings. And we can get into that whole separation of powers issue later on that. But the more important thing is that as they are stepping back, there's a conversation about, and there are some legislators, including some Republicans, who are like, I'm not sure if we want the governor to have so much unilateral power in the event of emergency, especially if it's go on. I mean, we haven't got to the point of some other states. I mean, some other states are looking at laws like if an emergency lasts more than 30 days, the legislature has to sign off on the actions of the governor. I don't think anybody's proposing that, but I know that Senator Brandis, one of the things he's talked about, and he's a Republican from the Tampa Bay area, he said basically maybe the governor shouldn't have unilateral power to do lockdowns. Now, his argument is things were fine with Governor DeSantis, but what if he wasn't there? So I'm going to wait to see if that becomes an issue where they take a closer look at the emergency powers. I mean, the thing is they were kind of put in place with the idea of a hurricane. you're dealing with a disaster that's coming down on the state, and you've got to deal with things in a rapid fashion. I don't think anyone envisioned a state of emergency, lasting a year.
Right, right. And the balance of powers has been a long running topic and ebb and flow in this nation and in this state. So I want to keep us moving and talk about one of the questions that somebody might ask is, well, the state, we're short a few $billions potentially. We have a desire to spend on some really great programs. Why don't we just go raise some more money? What about gambling? What about online sales taxes? What about other taxation? So Gary, I'm going to turn to you first, and Jennifer, ask you the same question, please.
Well, gambling is, one is tempted to start thinking about Moby Dick and the white whale that one is pursuing around the planet. There's a lot of moving parts on that. There's a lot of different special interests that are affected by that debate. The fact of the matter is that the Seminole Tribe of Florida had a compact with the state that allowed them to collect a certain amount of money. That deal has sort of lapsed, and that money is, and there's various legal reasons, but the state's not getting anything. And so, but the Seminoles are continuing to do the things that they were granted under the compact. They're just not paying the state anymore for it. And so the question is, well, how are you going to get a deal with the Seminole Tribe of Florida to get money flowing back into the state coffers? And frankly, what you'd have to do is you'd have to do some sort of expanded form of gambling that you would give them. And therein lies the rub. I mean, that's the complication as to whether or not all the sides, because you also have the sort of the pari-mutuels, the tracks that, of course, we no longer have dog racing in Florida. That's gone, but you still have the other types of gambling that are allowed at those facilities. And so it's a complicated stew of all sorts of stuff. And every year we ask about this and say, well, we're discussing it, and we just never seem to have that come to fruition. Now, as for the online component, as I said, there appears to be support in the Senate to pass a bill that makes it incumbent upon the retailer to collect the tax that's owed by virtue of an online transfer. The argument from the state is like, look, you're supposed to pay sales taxes anytime you buy anything online anyway. But again, dealing with laws and the evolution of laws and some recent Supreme Court rulings, it's gotten so that states can more easily do that. But Florida hasn't followed suit. I think last I looked, 48 or 49 other states have since adopted some sort of legislation related to collection of online sales taxes. So the Senate is on board with that. But like I said, there was a conversation. Well, how do they make that revenue neutral? Because I think the initial projections were, hundreds of millions, if not over $1 billion, could theoretically be collected by the state if you started doing this. But then you get into that whole tricky thing, as I told you earlier, that it requires a supermajority vote to quote raise taxes. Well, the argument of the Senate is, well, we're not raising taxes. But I think to further their argument, now they're saying, well, but let's keep it revenue neutral. So I don't know how that's going to look unless I think part of what they're discussing is, well, we'll lower taxes somewhere else. And then by virtue of taking in the increased revenue from the online taxes, we're going to offset it with a tax cut somewhere else. And it will be utterly fascinating to see who they decide to give that tax break to.
Very good. Jennifer, what's your take on the revenue generation question?
I have a little different perspective than Gary. I'm going to correct a couple words. I'll clarify those words. How about that? And I don't represent the Seminole Tribe, and in fact have represented organizations who don't want to see an expansion of gambling in Florida. And there's now an amendment that passed to our Constitution that requires that any expansion of gambling is going to have to go before the voters of the state of Florida. So the legislature couldn't. Their hands are tied a bit right now. They could not expand gaming per se.
But it doesn't apply to the tribe.
True, but that's different. So we'll take the tribe separately. The $350 million that the Seminole Tribe of Florida, and this is again Jennifer's perspective, was paid voluntarily to the state even after the compact with the state had expired. So basically, the legislature had a deal with the Seminole Tribe about certain things that only the tribe could offer. And so After that compact actually expired, the tribe still paid $350 million to the state. So in my opinion, that was voluntarily. So it's not that they're not paying. They don't have an agreement right now. And I do hope after many, many years, I think we're at what, 10 or 12 years now of trying to make this work and be able to renew that portion of the Seminole Compact in the state of Florida. That would be helpful because I think Florida has a good partner with the tribe. In terms of the online sales tax, I think a better way to describe it is remote sales tax. And Gary hit the nail on the head though about people looking at it as a tax increase. In Florida, we have what's called a use tax. So in other words, you pay sales tax on every piece of tangible personal property you purchase. Anything you purchase that you have, you can take in your hand, you pay sales tax on it. You pay a state sales tax and maybe a local tax as well. If you purchase something, whether it's through the phone, whether it's online, whether it's through the mail, if you purchase something remotely outside the state of Florida, and that retailer doesn't collect the sales tax and remit it to Florida, you as a citizen of the state are required under Florida law, hasn't changed, to remit what's called a use tax. You're bringing that item into the state to use it. So it's not a new tax. It's a tax that's already due that candidly, if right now, if you haven't gone on the Department of Revenue's website and you want to go find the form that you have to fill out to actually remit your use tax, I wish you lots of luck because it's difficult to find. This is really an issue, in my opinion. It's an issue of administration, and it is, we are one of the last states to actually do this, to say, let's make it simple for out-of-state retailers who don't have nexus in Florida. Let's make it easy for them to collect and remit to the state of Florida, because candidly, citizens aren't doing it. And 9 times out of 10, it really appears that people just don't know. They don't know that when you purchase something and sales tax isn't collected, that you then are responsible to actually remit that to the state of Florida. But I would agree with Gary. There's been some movement on the Senate side. I think the House has been the sticking point. We have a very conservative Florida House of Representatives, but I think that there's been a lot of work done, particularly with the retail community, in just explaining that this is a tax that is already due. We are simply trying to find a way to ease the administration of Florida actually accepting that tax as it comes in. The offset, that'll be interesting to see who ends up getting a tax cut if that's what happens. But let's hope that, you know, we can at least be able to focus on it from an administrative standpoint and resolve that issue so that, again, Florida is not the last state in the nation who hasn't done this.
Outstanding, outstanding. Great stuff. I feel like Chuck Todd, we're having back and forth. I love it. So Jennifer, I want to now ask you to take us a different direction. What's another sort of pressing issue that you think will be taken up in this year's legislative session? And what do you see sort of are the core elements to excuse me, to that issue? And then Gary, I'm going to prime you, you get the same question. So pick sort of an interesting issue. And before I turn to you, I want to tell our attendees, we're going to go to open Q&A in about 10 minutes. So start putting those Q&A questions in the Q&A. Jennifer, a big issue coming up in the session.
Okay, and Gary, you can't put questions in Q&A, just so you know. The a couple things that might be of interest, particularly to those listening to this. You know, one is related to data privacy, and if you want to have a little fun tonight, just Google big tech plus Ron DeSantis and look at the articles that the governor has, you know, talked about tech companies. And I think in general, they've largely been critical about, you know, the data or information that is on these websites. And it's probably directed, I won't say company names, but large social media companies that have had some sort of controversy about taking people off their websites or allowing them on or something similar. That is going to be an issue. There's a bill out there right now, and it's been filed by Representative Fiona McFarland, who's a freshman member, a rock star, a woman who's got an amazing military career. But she's filed a bill, House Bill 969, and it deals with data privacy. And it is like hundreds of pages long, or no, 100 pages long, somewhere around there. But it's a huge, long bill to describe how companies can utilize your personal information. I think it has even words like biometric information in it, how they have to utilize it, how they have to disclose to you what they're going to do with it if they're going to sell it to a third party. And I think there's a threshold in there with the size of the company. I want to say it's like 25 million or more global in revenue. So large companies, but it's not about something as simple as, can I go solicit so-and-so? It's really about the data that you are as a consumer inputting into a website or with a company, and what you allow that company to do it if they want to sell it. That issue, the governor had a press conference. It was him, it was the president, it was the speaker, to talk about this issue generally. He had a press conference with the Speaker Sprouse, Chris Sprouse, and it was a very, very detailed discussion about the concerns about consumer data and privacy of that data and what's happening as we have such a more virtual world. So I think you'll find that will be an issue. Another hot topic, I think, is going to be school choice. There's one of Gary's favorite topics, dealing with some scholarship programs and school choice issues. There's a big overhaul that we're looking at right now about dealing with some of these scholarship programs for K through 12 students and changing that to what could be described as universal vouchers. So here you have K through 12 students that are blended learning. Some of them are learning online. Some of them are back in school. Some school districts may want to or not want to. And there's a big discussion about how education is going to be delivered, I think, for decades into the future.
Outstanding. Thank you, Jennifer. Gary, what issues do you see that you want to speak to?
Well, I think the issue of big tech is going to be a major theme of the session. I would say there basically, though, there are three topics that Governor DeSantis has made a lot of statements about and comments about, and I think that basically they are a fallout of the very caustic and bitter election that we had in the past year, and the fallout of that. And while yes, there's data privacy, but there's also a discussion about deplatforming and things of that nature. And the House is looking at whether or not to pass a bill that would fine companies that deplatform someone running for office. I mean, and you see a lot of this is based on the sort of the anger that some conservatives have related to what happened to the president and some of the other people who were removed from Twitter and removed from Facebook. So there's some of that, and the House has been talking about that. I'm not sure. What I don't know is I don't know how it's all going to come out, and because the Senate so far, they have one very stripped down bill right now filed by Senator Burgess. That's basically, it's a public notice. Like, you have to get notice that you've been suspended and why you've been suspended. They haven't been talking about quite the large ideas, and in fact, Senator Simpson, the Senate president, even said that he wasn't sure what's going to be constitutional. What can the state actually do regarding a large, multinational corporation. But I think that's going to be an issue. I think the governor threw election law issues into the mix last week. And I think that there's also the issue of the governor's legislation relative to, you want to call it the anti-protest bill, anti-mob bill, the rioting bill, a series of enhanced penalties and things of that nature that he's made a very, loud push for in regards to it. I mean, but again, it's like he brought up that bill on the campaign trail when he was campaigning with the president. He's done a lot of spent a lot of time on Fox News and other conservative media outlets discussing the issues involving big tech. So there is a trio of legislation that you're seeing, and that is basically going to appeal to the Republican base, and I think that's going to be a large element of what's in session. When I look at what's going on, I say, okay, they're gonna be spending a lot of time in the budget, and they're gonna be, to Jennifer's point, yes, I think the school choice legislation is gonna be a major deal. I think these bills are gonna be, important, and I think there's some other things. There's some environmental issues, and I think some child welfare issues and things like. But I think a lot of these things right now are overshadowing. Now, I always throw this caveat in with every session. Even though I've been told that all the major ideas are out there, I always say to anyone watching the Florida Legislature, sometimes things bubble up. Now sometimes they are a result of outside forces. I think the terrible tragedy of what happened to Marjorie Stoneman Douglas in 2018 is an example of that. The legislature felt compelled to act, And, you know, even though they were on the last few weeks of their session in 2018, they passed a major bill dealing with school safety and dealing with guns and things of that nature. So you always have that possibility. But there is also the possibility that you could have something just come up that throws a curveball. A perfect example is one year, then Senate President Andy Gardner came out on the opening day and said, I want to push for a bill that would create a form of Medicaid expansion. This idea had not been broached with the House or the governor, and the Senate proceeded to try. Now, they didn't get what they wanted, but I'm just throwing that out there as, while people, well, especially people like me, some people who are lobbyists, they might have a better understanding of some things that might be.
It's not a dirty word. You don't have to say it quietly. It's not a dirty word.
I'm not saying that's a dirty word, but the point is that I think so far I haven't seen any indications that we're going to have some sort of major issue added to the mix. But I just wanted to add that caveat that it could happen, because it's happened in the past.
It's not over till it's over. Sure. Jennifer, did you want to follow up with something?
No, I think Gary covered it. It's true. It's crazy things can happen. We hope it's not something tragic. Obviously hope it's something that might be, good public policy. But yeah, things do end up happening, and they end up. Those are the type of things that everything grinds to a halt. So sometimes the bickering back and forth about issues that are very right or very left ends up, getting a little bit further, closer to the middle when you have a crisis to deal with. Thank God we haven't had a storm of significance. That's one thing that we end up worrying about. We have a hurricane or a series of hurricanes, all bets are off.
Great. We're starting to get some wonderful questions come in from our attendees. Ethan Merchant asks about the COVID-19 protocols and how it impacts the way you two do your business. So Jennifer, can you talk about the impact upon your work that you do and working with the legislature and your clients? And then Gary, how does it impact your reporting? So Jennifer, you first, please.
I don't have a press pass, so I'm not allowed in, but no, all kidding aside, the Senate has some pretty strict protocols, really no access to the Senate. The in-person meetings are being discouraged. So we're Zooming everything. And members of the Senate have been just great to work with. A lot of our clients that were planning to bring their Capitol visits, everybody has their day on the Hill, aren't able to do it. And so we're shifting a lot of these to Zooms, and everyone's been very accommodating. I think it's interesting. I have not had to do it. I've had folks on my staff do it, but to actually testify in a Senate committee from down at the Civic Center is apparently interesting. Not, the protocols in terms of social distancing and whatnot are fine, but actually looking at a monitor and it's your face, and you're not standing at a podium talking to a panel of senators is kind of interesting. The other thing is planning ahead. On the House side, if you want to speak in a committee or enter a committee room, you have to actually do it online. You have to register and submit an appearance form at least 3 hours prior to the beginning of that committee hearing. The good news is everything's noticed, so you know what's on it. But there's a really interesting thing that could happen. You could have a bill that perhaps has amendments that one may pass, one may not pass, or you might support something. And things that are happening real time in a committee, we're not going to be able to deal with that. So that's probably one of the biggest challenges. But it's a yeoman's task for both the House and the Senate. Of course, the governor having the middle part of the Capitol to deal with, to try to figure out how to deal with access. I really wish they would close the doors to reporters like Gary, just simply to, let the general public in. I'm kidding. But I do think that the testing and what's been happening in terms of members and their staff coming back and forth, again, they're going to all over the state and coming back to Tallahassee. I cannot imagine the behemoth of concerns that both the House and Senate have. So I think, our goal would be, let's get them out of here as soon as possible. Let's hope everyone's going home on April 30th and, come back in the fall when we've got more folks vaccinated.
Very good. Well, Gary, before you get your access revoked by Jennifer, what's life up there on the Capitol like for you up there?
Well, I will say I am wholeheartedly willing to go along with her endorsement of them coming in, getting down to work, and quickly leaving. I don't have any problem with that. What I would say is that, yes, I mean, so on the Senate side, but it's required on the House side as well. if you're a reporter and at least we've done this through, and as I understand it, we're going to continue this throughout session, is you have to get tested on a weekly basis. You have to go down, you have to get tested. And so that's part of the requirement on reporters if they want to have access. I would say, obviously it's an interesting challenge for lobbyists and people who are representing individuals and corporations, things like that, because I know Jennifer's aware of the axiom that you want to be in the room because it's less likely that they'll do something to harm you if you're in the room. That's that's it. I mean, I'm not saying that's always the case, but there has been a mentality that you show up as a lobbyist to represent your client because you want to make sure that they know you're there watching. And obviously that's not the way it is anymore. As for the press, yeah, it's presenting a challenge. Yes, I have access to the building, and yes, I can go into a committee meeting, but like for instance, in the House, you can't readily necessarily get to talk to a lawmaker after the committee meeting. They're going to rush them out of there. They're going to clean the room. The Senate's been a little bit more, less formal about that, but still, I mean, I had this thing where like one of the sergeants at arms like had a lawmaker made sure that they were at least 6 feet away and that they were at a distance in order to ask my questions. And the fact of the matter is that it does make the job a little bit difficult because sometimes things happen and you're a reporter and you need to ask somebody. You need to ask them, well, I don't understand what that amendment was about, or what did it do, or I mean, even as something as simple as what was the vote on that? I mean, like, because sometimes people will, you think you hear them saying yay or nay, but you don't. And then like, so in the past, what you go up to the committee secretary and say, can you give me the vote on Bill X? And now it's much more difficult to do that. But more importantly is I just don't know how often we're going to get a chance to talk to lawmakers and try to ask them what's going on and why did they do something or why did they not do something. And so I'm going to be intrigued as to how that all plays out in terms of the coverage.
Excellent. We're starting to get a bunch of questions come in. We're going to enter a bit of a speed round because we're getting a lot of great questions. Jennifer, can you, we've got one of my dear friends, Carol Weissert, who's a professor in political science, ask you to speak a bit more about the protest bill. What exactly is being contemplated? What's sort of the outcome that's desired there?
Well, I think the outcome that's desired is really dependent upon who you're asking that about. I think the House is pretty clear in terms of their bill numbering, and this is, we're going to go to 101. House bills are odd numbered bills. Senate bills are even numbered bills. The Combating Public Disorder bill in the House is House Bill 1. And that should be an indication that if it's a very low number, that it's a priority. It's got 3 committees of reference. It's been through one committee. I think it's got a long way to go in terms of what the final outcome is going to be. The Senate bill has 3 references as well, and it has not been heard yet in its first committee. But there was, I think it was the Revenue Estimating Conference actually was looking at the bill and whatnot. In terms of the outcome of what will happen with both bills, the bills right now are, I think they're identical. But I think listening to what both the House leadership and Senate leadership are saying in the news and what the governor's saying about what the intent is, and then actually reading what the bill has in it. So I mean, I would suggest I go back to those the House and Senate websites. Go in there, go to myfloridahouse.gov and click on House Bill 1 and just read it. Just look at it, and most of it's in layman's terms. But I think it's got a long way to go for both.
Great, thank you. Gary, for you, Stephen Rybicki asks about the status of the MCORS initiative of last year. Can you first of all briefly remind us what MCORS is, and then tell us where you see that going? And don't forget you're on mute.
Sorry, I was trying to be respectful. Yeah, that's basically the nomenclature for beginning a planning process to identify certain corridors throughout the state. And the main thing that they're connected to is the idea of creating 3 new toll roads in different parts of the state. And I think there was some conversation early on by some leadership about whether or not they were going to continue to fund that, given the budget situation. Senator Simpson made some comments of late that maybe suggested that there was still support in the Senate for it, that they weren't necessarily just going to, get rid of that. I mean, so what does that mean? Does that mean that might be a slowdown? They might not fund it fully. I mean, I'm waiting to see how that all plays out. I mean, what I haven't heard is any momentum to just do an outright repeal and to cancel the actions of last year.
Very good. Thank you, Gary. I'm interested to hear you talk about, Gary, go back to you on this one, and then Jennifer, maybe follow up with you as well. What oftentimes governors use sessions and legislative initiatives as a way to build their sort of governing portfolio. The question we've got from Alex Dominguez: which issue that will be handled this session will be most impactful on the governor's reelection and future political interests? Gary, what do you think are the biggest issues that might?
Well, I think the protest bill, the big tech bill, and the election bill were all related to creating enthusiasm among the Republican base that he's going to rely on when he runs for re-election, and furthermore, what he could use as a record run for president in 2024 if he indeed decides to do that. Now, I would also say, however, I think that while those are going to have a play with the base, I think what happens with the budget, and I think what happens with the pandemic response, I think those will have a great deal of impact, especially as we head into. I mean, I think everyone could acknowledge that. There are a lot of Democrats who are thinking about running for governor, but heading into 2022, I think a lot's going to depend on the economy, and it's going to depend on how the pandemic's going. That's going to play a pivotal role in how the electorate views Governor DeSantis and whether or not he should be awarded a second term.
Jennifer?
I have nothing to add. Just
All
kidding.
right.
No. I would agree with Gary. Listen, we've got two big elections coming up. We've got 2022, the governor's reelection, where he can run for reelection and serve a second term, which would give him 8 years total in the governor's mansion, and then also potentially what happens in 2024. I don't think it should be a secret to anyone what the governor has been focusing on as what's a priority. You hear him talking about, especially as it relates to COVID and the vaccine distribution, talking about seniors, talking about elderly individuals, talking about those that are most at risk. This vaccine distribution, say what you will about it, it's we're not prepared for a pandemic. This has kind of been crazy. So I think that would be probably my opinion at the top of the agenda, for the governor for reelection. And then I think also it's going to be a pocketbook issue. People are going to look at, they're looking at the cost of gas rising, and are they going to blame that on Ron DeSantis, or are they going to say, it's the federal government, or it's a whole other issue? I think it's going to be those pocketbook issues that people end up making, judging on that. And depending on what industry you're in, if the governor keeps his commitment in terms of, supporting tourism and keeping Florida open and bringing folks to Florida, that's going to affect how individuals can bring home, the dollars to be able to pay their mortgage, to be able to, take care of their kids. I think it's going to be very, very personal for people this next election cycle.
Very good. Very good. Jennifer, let me go back to you. Linda Edson wants to know a bit more about the school voucher program. Well, what's actually being proposed, and what's the accountability attached to sort of some of the new ideas being talked about? So that's Linda Edson's question.
I think Gary should go first. He likes.
Okay, yeah. He's got that Cheshire Cat smile. Okay, Gary. Let's
No. Jennifer is represented what's known as a scholarship funding organization, so she's very well versed in this issue. I think it's really been an interesting proposal. Essentially, Florida over the last 20 plus years has enacted a bunch of different programs that target different subsets of students, and you have the tax credit scholarship program that was started primarily for low-income children or children who come from low-income families. It has gradually kind of expanded a little bit in terms of the eligibility, but the fact of the matter is the program has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, and that part of it has been done with the blessing of the legislature. They've allowed it. There are other programs that target other children other sets of children and their needs in terms of what they need to try to succeed in the learning environment. So the deal is that some of these programs are funded inside the budget and come straight from state dollars. Some do not. In the event of the largest program, the tax credit scholarship program, it's actually corporations got a tax credit. In other words, they got a break on what they owed the state if they agreed to use their money for vouchers. What the legislation would do is it would consolidate everything, and it would put everything inside the state budget. And you no longer have tax credit scholarships that would be. So in other words, so for the organizations that do it, this means that they would no longer have to sort of ask corporations, can you pony up this year? Okay, so that's a big deal. Part of the reason it was done that way to begin with was because there was a concern from a legal situation. If the money is outside the Treasury, it made it more immune to legal challenges, although there were legal challenges. So you're talking about trying to combine all these programs. Now, Senator Simpson is one of the architects of this because he had involvements and conversations with those who run these programs. And he says, I've talked to him about it, and he said point blank, I don't understand why we have all these different programs. If I'm a parent, I don't understand which does what. Why can't, and so what we're talking about is we're talking about sort of creating what's called educational savings accounts, where you, the parent, just, you're given more control. That's what they're talking about doing. Now, in regards to part of the question is that these proposals do not pretend to subject the students who are in these programs to the same type of standards. Maybe that's the wrong word, but let's say the mandates that are on public schools. And I know that's been a sort of the talking point of opponents for years and years. But the argument from those who are supporters is that the determinant of whether or not this is the right decision is the parent's choice. And again, now what I'm going to be interested in seeing is I'm going to be interested in sort of how this works, because I am intrigued as to you're kind of going to assume that all this money that was being directed by corporations into the voucher programs will now flow into the Treasury, and then you'll be able to pay for these programs out of the Treasury. So I'm going to be interested in the implementation. I mean, it is a substantial retooling of what's going on.
Professor Greene, do you want to grade Gary, Mr. Fineout's answer?
That was an A+. He knows Aaron knows one thing you will learn about a reporter like Gary is he knows his issues, and a lot of that's coming from a lot of time in a newsroom. But what I will say is the bill number, just in case anybody wants to look it up, this is again K through 12 scholarships, and it's Senate Bill 48, and that's by Senator Manny Diaz, who has been a huge education reform proponent. And it does take 5 different scholarship programs, the tax credit being one of them, and combine them almost into 2. It collapses a couple of them. There's actually 2 of the scholarship programs that are named after former Senate presidents. The McKay Scholarship and the Gardner Scholarship will now be called the McKay Gardner Scholarship. But I do think the most significant, as Gary mentioned, is the fact that instead of a corporation paying their corporate taxes and directing or directing their tax credit to this program or fundraising outside of that program for contributions, it will go all through the state. So it's a significant, certainly a significant change in how the programs are administered. The Senate bill right now it's in its last committee of reference in full Senate appropriations. So if that tells you anything, we haven't even started the legislative session yet. We will in a week, of course. And that bill is going to be ready for the Senate bill. For the Senate floor shortly. So it'll be interesting to see again how it pans out. But I would say it's one of those bills that, as Gary mentioned, the Senate president has been very vocal on. This is important to him. Obviously, many of his comments in the press and publicly. And so I think, again, it goes to what's going to happen in education, both with the budget and then, of course, in programs like this is going to be interesting to watch. So Senate Bill 48, if you want to look that up.
Very good. Well, thank you. Thank you. We are at our appointed hour, friends. And I can tell you to all our attendees, we tend to keep these, we want to leave you wanting as you go away. To those of you whose questions we didn't get to, I'm sorry. We had a number of them. We actually had interesting questions for you, Gary, about the most interesting stories you've ever written. We're going to have to wait for that answer for another day. And Jennifer, there was a great question for you about what it's like being running a firm as a woman in what has traditionally been a male-dominated world that is changing. So that's another one. We're going to have you each back to answer those questions in a very different setting. So my immense thanks to Gary Fineout of Politico and Jennifer Greene of Liberty Partners for taking the time to share your expertise and insights. To our attendees, thanks for joining us. Our next IOP at FSU event is next Monday, March 1st at 6:30 p.m., the night before session kicks off. That's a very special event featuring Senator Mitt Romney and Senator Joe Manchin. And they're going, and that session is going to be moderated by my good friend Al Cardenas and the friend of many, Al Cardenas. And they're going to be discussing civic engagement, political participation, and civil discourse in contemporary American politics. To all of you for joining us, thank you very much from the Institute of Politics at FSU. Please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram. I've got a teenage daughter and I know all those things. So go look them up. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Jennifer. What a great event. And everyone, be well, stay well. Please wear a mask and stay tuned for future IOP programming. Thank you again.
Thank you.